Hello, literacy leaders and champions. Welcome to Literacy Talks, a podcast series from Reading Horizons, dedicated to exploring the ideas, trends, insights, and practical issues that will help us all improve our professional practice, knowledge, and confidence in teaching reading. Our host is Stacy Hurst, professor at Southern Utah University and chief academic advisor at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Joining Stacy are Donnell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, an author and a Utah-based elementary classroom teacher. In today's episode, we welcome a special guest, Dr. Matt Burns, a noted literacy and special education researcher, university faculty member, and one of the profession's leading voices. From rethinking student screening level to effective objective progress monitoring, this episode will give every reading teacher and coach important ideas and insights that matter in every classroom. Let's get started.
Welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. I'm Stacy Hurst, the host, and I'm joined by my awesome co-hosts, Lindsay Kemeny and Donnell Pons. And today we have a really exciting guest with us. And I need to preface this by saying he's only our second guest. We've had Anita Archer, those of you know, and now we get to have Matt Burns join us. So thank you for joining us today, Matt.
I can't believe I'm second to Anita Archer. That's pretty fantastic. Anytime I mention that same sentence, I'm pretty happy with that.
Well, we have you right up there. And then we also realized that happy accident, that it's alphabetical order. So we're going with Archer, then Burns. I don't know who are we going to have next? Who starts with C? We'll have to think hard about that. Anyway, so we are going to just have a conversation. As you know, our format is we basically show up and talk about literacy. So I was able to email Matt some topics that we would love to hear what he has to say about. And Donnell and Lindsay, I know you have lots to say about these things too. So this will be just really as informal as we are. And we'll just start, I think. We'll just dive right in. First, I do want to ask Matt, and just a little bit about your background. I don't know that I know this, that I've heard this. Where are you from? How did you get into teaching? Where did you go to school? All those fun things.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of special education here at the University of Missouri, about to transition to join the youth life team at the University of Florida, which I'm extremely excited about. I was at the University of Minnesota for 10 years. I was at Central Michigan University for 5 years. I was a practicing school psychologist before that, and a special ed administrator. I was a special ed supervisor for 1 year. And after 1 year, that was enough time to conclude, that's a terrible job. I don't want to do that anymore. I did something else. I got into literacy really because my area of expertise was learning disabilities. Early on in my career, I was sort of the person that you called when you didn't know what else to do. I used to say that was my sort of line. That was my job. And I loved it, and I still love it. I still love those kids. Those are still the ones that are closest to my heart. But then when I was working with kids and realized that number was going up and up and up, and thought, we've got to make a change. There's a systems issue here going on. And that's why I changed my focus from how to help this individual kid to how to help more than one kid, how to help all kids.
Wow, that is great. Thank you for sharing that. This is a topic that's impacted all of us on some level. That's a pun, because we're going to talk about reading levels. But, and I know I've been accused of being overly dramatic about this, but as a young teacher, I was brand new, probably year 1, year 2. And if you've listened to the podcast, Lindsay and I have totally owned that we fully embrace balanced literacy. That was what we did back in the day. And I was really enamored with the idea of reading levels, specifically Fountas and Pinnell. And I'd learned a little something of readability formulas in my undergrad education. So I really was trusting and relying on the fact that there was a solid formula to those levels. I used them before I had the thought to look into what they were. But I remember the moment that I realized that there really isn't a very solid psychometric formula that went into those levels. And I do describe it like this. My heart dropped That's the dramatic part. But then I thought about the implications of that. I had been communicating those levels to the parents of my students. I had been, all of my instruction was focused around that. Lindsay, I'm sure you can relate. And to realize it was basically a myth was really impactful. So I know you've done some really awesome research about this. Could you share with us what you found?
Yeah, so I am enamored with levels as well, but a slightly different take probably. Early on in my career, I still do research in this area. We took a bunch of kids who were identified as emotional and behavioral disorder or ADHD non-medicated, just really pretty highly off-task kids. And all we would do is one of two things: either give them a book or a passage. I tend to use passages because that is more tightly controlled, and that they can actually read, or take whatever they're supposed to read in class and do some pre-teaching so they can actually read it. And their time on task goes way up every single time. And we just finished a meta-analysis a couple years ago. Now, we found there's a moderate effect on behavior for almost any academic intervention we do among kids with behavior problems. So based on that, we go back to Gickley and Armstrong, and before that even all the way back to Hargis and Betts. Betts in 1946, don't quote me on the exact date, said, you know what? Kids can learn better if they can read about 95% of the words correctly. And that anecdotal observation went two ways. Betts became the father of the informal reading inventory. This entire industry of levels, leveling assessments. Well, Hargis and his group eventually at Gickley started developing a measurement system where you can have the kids read what they're being asked to read and see can they actually interact with the text. And so the research I did focused on that latter. And so if we have a kid who's reading 80% of the words correctly, a simple pre-teaching to get him up to 93, 95, 97%, and we see time on task comprehension, task completion go way up. The problem is the other side of that bridge, went the other direction, the informal reading inventory. If I could, wave a magic wand in education, probably the first thing I would do would be to get rid of informal reading inventories. So Stacy already mentioned that there's no real reliable formula. But that's true. So research I've done with the Francis Spinell, others with the DRA, and Jerry John's basic reading inventory, we see that those levels are remarkably inaccurate, about as accurate as flipping a coin. And the worst part is the kids who are struggling readers, we found in an article we published in the Journal of School Psychology, we found that the kids who were low readers couldn't read the books that were at their levels. So the kids that need it the most are the ones that have the most trouble reading a book that's supposedly at their level. And the issue is not the construct of instructional level, it's with the measurement level. Data never generalize to or from an individual. And so if I do, so that means if I do a study with 5,000 kids and I find X to be true, that doesn't mean X to be true for this individual kid. The flip side of that is if I collect data from one kid, that doesn't generalize to anything else. So even if I have a good measure, which all these measures tend to have poor reliability, but even if I had a good measure and I assessed the kid and the kid was an M, and the M was a meaningful term, which I don't think it is, but let's say it is, we still don't know that they'll be able to read an M book. You just can't get that level of generalizability from any measure in the history of psychological testing. So that's why I say abandon the measures and abandon levels. I'd love to see a world where we no longer said kids read at a second grade level. What I'd rather see is, here's a kid, can they read this particular text? That's really all the best we can do.
Yeah, that's great. That was in my next question. How does that look in application?
There should be a general rule where we can see that this book is a higher level than this one. Okay, I can accept that. And I think Lexile does that pretty well. I can live with Lexile as a baseline. And among the good readers, don't worry about it. Among the good readers, let them pick the books they want to read, the materials they want to read, let them go. Great. If occasionally they need some support, fine. Chances are they won't. But the striving readers, the low readers, those are the ones we're going to take them back, whatever they want to read, be it assigned or something they pick, have them read you for a minute, and just simply see, can they read 93 to 97% of the books? That one little assessment we've done, I don't know how many studies on it now, but we find that those are reliable data. We found that modifying it to match that, increase comprehension, completion, and time on task. And we've replicated that a number of times. So among the struggling readers, just take a book that roughly approximates their lexile and just make sure they can read it. Just take 1 minute. See, can I read roughly 95% of the words, 93 to 97% to be exact. That will give you a better estimate of the child's ability to successfully interact with a text than any reading measure that takes 20 to 30 minutes to give.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about all the time we've spent on those informal reading inventory, all the time we've spent on
I was working with a district not long ago who was a Fontes-Pinnell district. I showed them the 54% accuracy. I showed, to be more clear, the Fontes-Pinnell benchmark assessment system. The accuracy of that data was about 54%, so pretty inaccurate. When you look at the skills of the kids all at the same level, all roughly, let's say a G, for example, and I actually don't make that up. I was debating a teacher not long ago about the importance of Fontes-Pinnell, and she was arguing it was important. So I asked her to pull up her data, and I literally just grabbed a bunch of Gs and did no manipulating, just grabbed a bunch of Gs. And one kid was at the 70, they had a bunch of data, all at a G for the benchmark assessment system. One was at a map test, 73rd percentile, and one was a map test, first percentile. One was reading 80 words a minute on Dibbles, and one was reading 20. But according to the benchmark assessment system, those kids have the same reading needs. No. So I was showing the data to a school a few years ago, and they actually said, okay, we'll try it without it. And the two of the teachers on the decision-making bodies, maybe 10 teachers there, two of the teachers actually started to cry. They didn't know what to do. They were upset, and they said, no. We spend the first 2 weeks of school giving this assessment. I can now spend the first 2 weeks of school teaching. They were so happy. They literally broke down into tears.
So, Matt, you've said something really important that I don't want to pass by here. You've said something about knowing where the student is at, and that takes time listening to the student do the thing you're asking them to do, and that is read. So let's talk a little bit about, because you talked about those first 2 weeks where teachers are taking data, and are we actually sitting next to a student and listening to them read? Because I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a classroom and asked a teacher where some students are at. What do you think they could read this passage? And there's the look of blank, like, geez, I don't know. And we're mid-year because I've never heard that student read. Can you talk to that a little bit?
I can't emphasize how important that is. As a reading interventionist, someone will call me and say, hey, come help me with my kid. The very first thing I'm going to do is have that kid read to me. My issue with the benchmark assessment system, the DRA, and all of those is not, it is. I was about to be more kind. I will say this. I have no confidence in the score. Sitting down with a kid, having them read to you from a grade level passage or a couple of them, even an easier one and a more difficult one, that can be really helpful information. But the issue is we tend to look at the score and make all the decisions on the score. And it's that score that has no reliability. It's the score that's the problem. That's one of the advantages of Dibbles and Acadians and all of those is you actually have the kid read to you, which I still think are invaluable data, but not in a running record way. So I will be clear about that. My issue with running records is there's too much subjectivity. It depends on the decision you're making, right? So if you just want to work with a kid and you're just kind of assessing them informally, a running record type approach where you just kind of judge things is totally fine. But if you're using it to screen kids or using it to make, decisions that will involve different interventions and resources, well, those data aren't reliable enough. So that's why something like Acadians or Dibbles or all those others, EasyCBM, FastBridge, AimsWeb, those give you a more structured framework that is not subjective or has much, much, much less subjectivity, and therefore the data are more reliable.
And they don't take long, right? I mean, I love using Acadians in my classroom and progress monitoring. It's 2 minutes, and it lets me know if, okay, we're on track, or, let's revisit what we're doing because we need to change something.
Yeah, schools are terribly inefficient when it comes to assessments. We have this mindset that, 30-minute assessment will give you more data than a 1-minute assessment. Well, no, it'll give you different data maybe, but not necessarily better. I think we waste a lot of time in schools with assessments. These schools that assess kids with every kid gets Dibbles, MAP, Fontes-Pinnell, that is such a waste of time. And I tell schools, when you do that, look at the decisions you make If for example, identifying all the same kids as needing help on all three of those measures, pick the cheapest one and use that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know as a literacy coach, I was guilty of that too. We also embraced the Fountas and Bunnell benchmark system. And that was decades ago, just to clarify. But I do want to say too, I think an unintended outcome of that is that teachers start viewing assessment as separate from teaching. It's something we do the first 2 weeks of school, and then we teach, right? And to your point, Matt, there is a huge range. You can look at a level M. If 5 kids on that level, they're all on that level for different reasons. Their accuracy is different. Their, automaticity is different from one kid to another. So I appreciate that we're having this conversation. I just have one more question related to this. How does decodable text relate to the conversation we're having?
So decodable texts are a very specific tool. Decodable texts are designed to help the kids practice the skill you just taught them. You have to do that. You can't have good instruction without that step in the sequence. So decodable texts are different. They're designed. Now, a decodable text means that there are some things you just taught the kid, but there's other things that the kid has already been taught, and so it's not new material. So by definition, a decodable text should be an instructional level, because the new stuff that's involved in there should be the things you just taught them. So by definition, if the instruction is going well, every decodable text should be an instructional level for that kid. And then use that decodable text to have them practice what you just taught them. But you certainly are probably going to be having the kid engage in other types of reading as well. And we want to make sure we have children able to read the text that they're reading for that purpose as well. The child should be doing more connected text reading than just a decodable text.
Yeah, agreed.
And that's one thing I think is so exciting. I just finished, my first year teaching first grade. And I love that, moving them from decodables to regular text and just kind of gently helping them. And some of them needed more scaffolding. And it was so exciting to see and be able to all of a sudden apply all those phonics skills we'd been learning, in a regular text.
Yeah. And they get excited about that too. My heart will forever be in first grade. And that's one reason, just to see them become grown-up readers right before your eyes. What I do have a question too about, in first grade, I could control how often my students read, it was always out loud at that point. But I have worked since with a lot of teachers who are teaching older grades, and Donnell, you can really relate to this, I'm sure, in other subject areas that have never heard their own students read. They're making a lot of assumptions about those older learners that they've been taught to read, or that their reading is, for some students, maybe more proficient than they assume. What do you recommend in those kind of settings?
Well, a while ago, working with a school, a secondary school district, but they wanted to start an MTSS system at the high school. And the representative of the ELA department was on the team. And I kept deferring to that person about literacy. And finally, she stopped me and said, "Man, I appreciate how respectful you're being." But she goes, "You understand, my major in college was literature, not literacy." This is the quote: "Ask me whatever you want to know about Shakespeare. I do not know how to teach a kid how to read." So I do think that we have to spend more time with secondary pre-service teachers and in-service teachers, just the basics of read. Just as long as they know what fluency is, what comprehension is, as long as, and some basic ideas of what decoding is. They don't need to be literacy experts. Absolutely. They don't need to. But I will say that a very basic knowledge of literacy at the secondary level makes social studies and science wonderful opportunities for literacy instruction and intervention. It's not a complicated process. We can pull materials that align with the scope and sequence of the curriculum and have them do practice. We can do repeated reading with social studies content, super easy, for example. So it doesn't take much. I do think we have to be a little more intentional and to support those teachers, both pre-service and in-service. But when we do, we have a wonderful opportunity to help build both content knowledge and literacy. In fact, I have a grant now where we're doing that very thing at the middle school level. We're looking for schools to infuse literacy practices into social studies, mostly vocabulary work, lots of vocabulary, and trying to see its effect, see if we can see increases in reading comprehension, but more importantly, or not more importantly, but more likely, will these kids who are struggling readers now be able to access the content more effectively? So just a little bit of work with the secondary level, we can increase reading skills and increase content acquisition.
Yeah, man, I'm taking notes. There's a lot to be done, huh? Especially in that space. I know I'm teaching a graduate level course, and about half my students right now are teaching in high school, and they're taking the course because of this, because they know that they have students who can't read and they want to help. And I am glad to hear you say that they don't have to be reading specialists, because I get overwhelmed thinking, oh, how can I teach them everything they need to know? But you're right. If they do know the basics, then it kind of becomes, the challenges probably are more systemic at that point than they are with the teacher in the classroom, I guess.
What's your class you're teaching, Stacey?
It's foundational knowledge of literacy. It's for the literacy specialist endorsement here in the state.
Okay. Oh, it's great they're taking that. A 10th grade social study teacher probably doesn't need to have a strong background in teaching morphology, for example. But if they know what reading fluency is and how to build reading fluency and how doing so directly improves comprehension, well, that's probably the level of skill they need.
Yeah. And that's a great segue, because fluency is another topic we want to talk about. And I want to actually have Lindsay share to start that she has implemented something that you recommend. And Lindsay, just talk about your experience with that and what you've seen.
Well, it's called Partner Reading Paragraph Shrinking. And I learned about it from you, Matt. He did a presentation for Patton. And, that year I was teaching second grade, and this intervention is designed for 2nd through 8th graders. And it was at the beginning of the year. And I remember I was already just frustrated because I had, half my class was well below the benchmark, the Cadence benchmark. And I'm just thinking, what am I going to do? How do I, And so he gave this presentation about a class-wide reading intervention. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I need. I need a class-wide intervention, because I can't, it's like so hard to do intervention for over half your class. And it's really simple. There's many research. There's, Matt, you, I guess, did the research study on it, and it's a pared down version of PALS, PALS, right? And so I think our class median was 50 words correct per minute. I did this intervention for 2 weeks, and our class median was 64 words correct per minute at the end of 2 weeks. And I was just sold. So I, kept doing it throughout the week. But I'm always just saying how grateful I am for that presentation that you gave and your work on that, Matt, because that has just made such a difference in my classroom.
You probably don't remember, when you tweeted about that.
Yes.
October 12th, 2021.
Yeah.
I emailed you and asked if you don't mind if I share that tweet, if I screenshot it and I put it in lots of presentations, and I'm looking at it right now.
Oh, cool.
The second grade, 50 words a minute to 66. I love that you do that. And I plug your website every time I present. I tell them the ways I understand that you made not changes to the intervention, but to make it more kid friendly. And it's really cool. That intervention came from working with PRESS, Path to Reading Excellence in School Sites, when I was in Minneapolis, at the Minnesota Center for Reading Research. We developed this really cool intervention program. And when we started running the interventions, we had a huge grant from Target Corporation. So we were drunk on money. We had all kinds of money. And so I had 24 research assistants. So if I saw what you're thinking of earlier, Lindsay, 25 kids and 20 of them are low, I had the resources. I just ran a bunch of small group interventions with all my research assistants. And we saw the kids did really well, but the number of kids scoring the proficient range didn't go up in the winter benchmark assessment. And it hit me, Amanda Vanderheiden taught me this many years ago, 2003, that without good core instruction, nothing else matters. And so we panicked and we went and bought PALS for all the teachers, peer assisted learning strategies, which Lindsay mentioned. I'm only careful to plug that and let you know that that's where this came from. And we showed it to the teachers, and the teachers basically said, no, we don't want to do that. And so we peeled everything else back and just brought it down to fluency. And paragraph shrinking is a comprehension technique, but basically really focusing on fluency. And the reason we did that was for a while there, around early 2000s, we saw a big push for reading fluency in the classrooms. But reading fluency work has seemed to have been forgotten a little bit more lately. Tim Shanahan and Tim Rosinski talk about this all the time. But fluency is that way to build automaticity. Fluency is basically automatic decoding, right? And so if you're building fluency, you're taking what they're learning and decoding and making it automatic. And we found 2 studies I've done saw that unless kids can read 60 words a minute in elementary school, they tend not to comprehend. So if I have a kid reading 30 words a minute and the teacher says, oh, comprehension, the first thing I'm going to do is fix the fluency problem. And most of the time when we do that, the comprehension problem becomes much less severe and sometimes even just goes away. So we said, okay, let's just build this fluency building practice. And we did that for 2 weeks, and we didn't pick 2 weeks. We said, try this first group of teachers here, try this for 2 weeks, just because we thought they'd agree for 2 weks. And they say, okay, sure, we'll try it for 2 weeks. And I said, we'll come back, we'll do an assessment, we'll talk to you, we'll see how it went. And I forget, I probably have right here, since I had that open. But the medians, the very first time we did it in second grade, I do have right here, went from 81 words a minute to 104 and 87 words a minute to 115, just in 2 weeks. And so we have since studied this quite a bit, and we published it. We've done randomized trials, and we published it in various journals and such. And you see that, this quick little 20-minute fluency practice every day for 2 weeks with elementary school, 3 weeks at the middle school, results in pretty nice jumps in fluency and resulting comprehension. Monica Romero, a student of mine who just defended and is going to be an assistant professor next year at the University of Texas, Austin, did her dissertation on this. And she was the first one to really study the effect on comprehension. And comprehension is where we saw an even bigger jump. So once we address that fluency issue, we tend to see big jumps in fluency and comprehension.
It's a connector between those lower parts of what we call phonemic awareness and phonics, and then vocabulary and comprehension. If we're talking about those 5 areas, it's really impactful. Lindsay, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, I love it because it's just an opportunity to practice. I think a lot of teachers just think fluency is going to develop on its own, or silent reading is going to lead to fluent reading, but they need more practice reading aloud. And that's what this intervention provides. And then I was switched to first grade this year. And so you'll remember, Matt, because I went back and forth with you, like, what intervention did you use in first grade and all this? Well, I tried partner reading paragraph shrinking in first grade. I waited until it was the very end of January after our middle of the year benchmark. And I started everyone out with decodable passages. And I'm like, hey, this is just an opportunity for them to practice, to help automatize some of those skills. And then I transitioned them into regular text as they were ready, which was a little bit different for the different students. And then I also had, I took longer to introduce it. So I didn't do paragraph shrinking at first. And I took a little bit longer teaching them, the first half of the intervention. And then I had my literacy coach come in my room with me when we first had him try paragraph shrinking. I'm like, I don't know if this is too much for first graders. Help me know what you think. We're going to walk around and listen. And it was really exciting to see how well they did. So before the intervention, they had 37 words correct per minute. That was our class median. And after, I think I did it 3 weeks, and it was 60 words correct per minute.
Yeah. And research continues to tell us that repeated reading is the best way to increase fluency, right?
Yeah, you can make an argument best way, but it's certainly an effective way. But I will say the point Lindsay made, which I think is important, it doesn't happen on its own. And silent reading fluency doesn't necessarily mean the translation to reading fluency. That's why I really encourage partner reading is great because they read to each other. And it's fun. Lindsay, we rarely see behavior problems happen during this intervention. You were with first graders.
And the same thing, because guess what? You're giving them all something that they can be successful with. And they're all engaged in doing something the entire time. And in fact, when I gave a presentation on it and I did a little video clip showing my students all doing it. I just kind of panned across the room. And I remember in that presentation, a teacher raised her hand and said, well, it looks like you don't have any behavior issues in your class. So what about if we have kids that struggle with behavior? And I'm like, no, I do. But they like this activity. They can do it.
Say hello to the new Reading Horizons Discovery, the evidence-based foundational literacy program educators asked for. With innovative technology to support teachers and students, a complete collection of decodable books, a digital sound wall, built-in real-time coaching, and more, Reading Horizons Discovery puts it all together to help K through 3 students achieve reading proficiency. Now you can take off with a trusted science of reading approach and simple instructional method. It's easy to stay on top of student progress and individual needs with a tech-enabled tool and streamlined student data. Take action to transform reading challenges into literacy success. Go to readinghorizons.com/product guide to download your program overview today.
We had a kid one time who was a very cute little boy, but emotional behavior disorder. And I forget the grade, early, like maybe 3rd grade. And the teacher didn't have the kid participate in this activity. Well, and I came in and saw that and said, well, can you try it? And she was hesitant. But then she had this other boy who was a really, really, really high reader. And she didn't think the partnering was going very well with him for this particular kid. So she decided to switch that kid. And she said, okay, I'll take this kid with emotional behavior disorder and put him in there and see what happens. And the first time, he and his partner got very little accomplished because he was so happy to be participating. He giggled the entire time. And I'm not kidding. He giggled the entire time. He couldn't contain himself. And got to the point where his partner was this kind of quiet student, started giggling too, and they had a great time. But the next day, he was on task the entire time. And it worked really well for him, just in terms of being able to interact. So it's really amazing to watch. We developed this in inner city Minneapolis. And we were in some schools with, there were frequent reprimands, et cetera, and redirects for behavior. Never during this. Only once did we see a teacher say, I really think I'd like to do something with behavior because they don't be on task as they want them to be. So that teacher gave them a goal, and she gave them 2 behaviors, I forget the behaviors, keep your voice low and talk only about reading or something. And she would walk by, and if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, she would put a check mark on their little folder we give them. And at the end of the week, if they had some number of check marks, they got some class. And she said that took care of the problem right there.
I like that. That's a good idea. I sometimes, I guess with the first graders, paragraph shrinking, sometimes they would, I don't know if they were really off task though. They just would start, well, maybe a little bit. They'd start talking a little bit more about it, but it's usually just because they might, need more help in directing, or they usually are pretty good about raising their hand and saying, we disagree on who the most important, person is in this paragraph. And then I would go and help them. But yeah.
That's awesome. That'd be so fun.
Yeah, it was fun.
That is really great. And I think it just emphasizes, and with the last topic, it emphasizes too, students need to be reading out loud frequently in a school day. And I know there's been research done about how many minutes a student will read out loud in those early grades, and it's minimal. But we need to increase it. I know when I was a beginning teacher, I read research about fluency, and we had just started giving the Dibbles assessment in my state. And so I was really interested in how that develops. But I think it was Tim Rosinski, and I read that if they were reading out loud for 20 minutes a day, 20 to 30, and we had read aloud time in my class. It wasn't partner reading. I wish I had known about that. They literally were reading out loud, each individual student at the same time every day. And we had a lot of processes and procedures around that. But I think that made more of a difference than a lot of other things I could have tried. And of course, it sounded, you have to be able to tolerate a certain level of cacophony. They were all reading different books. But I think that is one takeaway any teacher could have, right? To increase the time their students are actually reading in the school day.
Yeah, but doing so in a structured manner.
Yes.
Which is why partner reading is so important. Just giving the kid, you want to do this, I don't mean to imply that, but there's better, higher quality oral reading than activities than now. So just make sure it's structured and engaging, and you can see really pretty positive growth from that quick little intervention.
Yeah. And again, everybody's on task. That was really exciting to see and talk about. Okay. We have had a lot. I know there's been a lot of conversation lately about phonemic awareness. And I would say this whole conversation, with or without letters in instruction, I honestly think a lot of we've talked about this a lot between the three of us. The timing that this became known to people, I think, was problematic. But talk to us about, I know you, I feel that you're strongly on the side of introducing letters with those phonemes. Talk to us about that, how you concluded that, and what your thoughts are about that practice.
Well, I'm going to contextualize that broader before I hit that specifically. I, of course, as everybody in this call are involved in, each passionate about making sure the instruction is based in science.
Sure.
And I think we've had many mistakes when it comes to literacy in the past. And one of which is we tend to do a lot of hero worship in literacy. I keep threatening to do this study. I never will because I don't want to make everybody mad, but I want to look at the citations in the reading teacher. The reading teacher is a fine journal. It's a research and practice journal. I use it, and lots of colleagues who do. But the citations I've noticed in the reading teacher tend to be today less quantitative research, and they're citing a bunch of opinion pieces. We get our heroes, and we think whatever that hero says is true. And sometimes that's okay. No, it's never okay. But sometimes you get away with it because the hero is a researcher, et cetera. But then we've got people who I'm not going to call them out by name. Just listen and sold the story. Emily Hanford is braver than I am. She'll call them all out by name, and did. And we think just because they say it must be true. Well, we now know, of course, that's wrong. And what they were saying wasn't based on research, et cetera. But now we're doing it again. Advanced phonemic awareness hypothesis is exactly a hypothesis. It's an interesting idea. It's never been studied. I would actually argue it's inconsistent with previous research, but it's an interesting idea that's never been studied. Well, so is 3Q, right? Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's see let's look and see if this is really an effective practice or not before we start using it all across the country. And so I heard about the advanced phonemic awareness hypothesis. I've never seen anything studied about it, so I see if I could find something and didn't find anything. Then all of a sudden I realized schools all over the country are doing these quick 1-minute drills and all these, teaching. Here's the big issue for me. Here's why it became so interesting is on the Science of Reading Facebook page, Science of Reading, where I showed you in college, people post on there, hey, I have this kind of a kid. I need help. What do you recommend? I have a fifth grader who's really struggling with reading. What should I do? And people kept posting all these phonemic awareness interventions. Fifth grade? No. So I went back and looked at the original National Reading Panel. The effect size for grade for preschool was 1.25. The first grade went down to 0.49. Now they did second through sixth grade all one. I wish they would have broken it up more, and they didn't. So I can't really report like fifth grade versus whatever. But clearly, the younger the kid is, the more effective phonemic awareness interventions are. And the other one that really struck me was if it included letters as part of the instruction, the effect size is 0.67. If it didn't, it was 0.38. Now, that's not zero. 0.38 is not zero, right? But it's almost twice as effective to include letters. Most of the studies did include letters. There were a small number of them that just did phonemic awareness only or did phonemic awareness for like a month and then taught letters. Most of the studies, they either started letters like on the second week or letters were incorporated throughout the entire intervention process. So using letters makes it more effective. And it makes it more effective on phonemic awareness outcomes, and it makes it more effective on reading outcomes. So that's why I sort of got interested in this research and started playing with it a little bit and thinking through it a little bit more. But clearly, those are two things that jumped out at me was age and the inclusion of letters. So if you include letters, again, if you don't, the effect size is not zero. There's a positive effect, but it's much more effective if you include letters. And by including letters, most of the studies did something like they would teach blending or segmenting, and at the end, teach them the 3 or 4 letters that made, and not even so much teach it and teach them mastery, just sort of show them the 4 letters that made the sounds they worked on today, and like that type of thing. Just a quick little, at the end of it, just show them what letters you use, or do a couple minutes on teaching letter sounds as well.
I love that we're at the point in teaching with science that we can refine our knowledge. And I know that everybody's on a different learning curve, and some people are just learning about the science for the first time. But I really appreciated what you had to say about hero worship. I think we need to be careful of that. And one thing I've been really impressed with you and with Tim Shanahan, honestly, is that, and Tim Shanahan, I've, been familiar with my whole career, but I feel like in many ways you do that. You follow the research. In fact, recently on Twitter, I saw you kind of get into it with Tim Shanahan. You're correcting him. He'd said, there's no research on it. And you said, you were wrong. Here they are, right? I appreciate that because the focus isn't on that person. It's on the facts or, what we know. Part of the problem with that whole phonemic awareness thing you pointed out accurately is that, well, if so-and-so says it, it must be true kind of a thing. I also think it became so divisive because of that, in part, that as a whole, we weren't so solidified in the science. We didn't have foundational knowledge enough to say, okay, let's look at this objectively. It kind of upended the apple cart for a lot of people, I think. And so it became more of an issue than if it were to come up now. That's just my unexpert opinion.
And, Stacey, another thing, and I'm so glad we're talking about this, and Matt, you did such a good job of diving into this area that can be fairly contentious. We need to be careful, too, to remember that something that we read or learn, we need to stay closer to what we read and learned as we get into teaching. So I see a lot of practices that then take off once a teacher's in a room sometimes, and pretty soon you're doing 15, 20 minutes of something and you don't even have anything to originally back it up. You started with a good idea, but you always have to make sure you're maintaining your knowledge and checking yourself to make sure you're staying on the track, because it's pretty easy to get off track sometimes with something that feels good or feels right, and to make sure you check and maintain where you're at. It's always a good idea.
And we also have to remember, as I said earlier, data never generalized to or from an individual. You do something and it works for one kid or a classroom, we have no idea why that did or didn't work. And we tend to think, oh, well, it worked for that kid, so it must be something that's better than whatever else is. And we don't know it to be true. Quick story, I used to do a lot of work with Chris Riley Tillman, who's now a dean, so he doesn't join me in presenting and researching as much anymore. But he and I used to do trainings on interventions, and he tells a story about trying to identify what the cause is, because he does behavior, I do reading and math. But he has a kid that they've written a behavior plan and tried everything they could try. And then all of a sudden, the kids started doing really well. Oh, this is it. We found the behavior intervention. This is it. Then spring break happened, and they came back from spring break, and the kids' behavior was as bad as ever. So they talked to the parents and found out that the parents told the kid, look, there's 2 weeks until spring break. You do really well between now and then, and we'll take you to Disney. And so it had nothing to do with the interventions. That happens a lot in education. Kids do better, and we don't really know why. We assume it's because of what we're doing right then and at that very moment. It may or may not be. So we take that learned lesson and apply it next year and assume we'll see the same results. We may not. So if you see something that works and try it again, I'm not saying don't do that. Absolutely. But be sure to be assessing it objectively as well to make sure it really was what you were doing and not something else.
Teachers as learners and scientists, and then we look for those kind of things, right? Mm-hmm. So I know that you had made mention to me that you were excited to move to the University of Florida, and that part of what you get to focus on is dyslexia. Mm-hmm. And how will that look? And what is your interest and background with dyslexia?
Yeah, reading disability is always my big passion. I love those kids. My work with dyslexia is a couple of things. I tend to look at things from the assessment perspective. So I like to look at screening. I do intervention work as well, and I can talk about that. But I focus a lot on screening right now because of the Decoding Dyslexia movement. So Decoding Dyslexia is a wonderful movement. I'm about to disagree with them. So I'll give my nice words ahead of time, because they're wonderful parents. It's mostly parents. I was involved in the Decoding Dyslexia group in Minnesota before I moved here. So that would have been around 2014, 2013. And they were fabulous. And everything they said was right on. We need to make sure higher quality phonics instruction is happening. It was great. My disagreement with them was, I don't think the reason your kids aren't doing well is because they have dyslexia. I think they're not doing well because we're not teaching them as they need. And so I'm a little hesitant to be identifying children with dyslexia as an explanation as to why they're not doing well in school. So because of that, I looked at some screening measures because of this decoding dyslexia movement. We see every state in the country now basically have a dyslexia law on the books, and most of them deal with screening. So we did a study, and we saw that Sally Shaywood's scale, it's called the Shaywood's dyslexia screen, and DIBELS. And we used the CTOP, the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, as our criterion. Because we don't want to worry about being diagnosed dyslexia or not. That's too confusing. No. Did the kids have effective phonological processing or not? If they didn't, that was dyslexia. And we found that DIBELS predicted, or got it right, 85% of the time. Actually, predicted poor readers even better, like 90%. Whereas the Shaywood scale was less than 50% accurate. And so it has terrible accuracy to be a screening. And I will still contend two things. Number one, schools waste too much money. I said earlier, time. We also waste a lot of money. We want to buy the new thing, and so we go out and rush out and buy this new scale. And honestly, the second point I want to make is the best way to assess reading is to have the kid read. And so DIBELS screened better for dyslexia than any dyslexia screener we saw. And I don't mean DIBELS per se, but DIBELS is great indicating all those CBM oral and fluency measures are probably better screeners of dyslexia than most measures we purchase. And RAN, look at RAN. RAN's a great example. Rapid automatized naming. Rapid automatized naming has been long linked to reading problems in dyslexia. Rapid automatized naming predicts reading best if the measure is something like letter sounds or letter names. Pictures, shapes, the correlation with them in reading measures drops quite a bit to, 0.3, 0.35. So if, again, the best measure of RAN is letter names, unless the kids don't know the letter names, right? So if it's a preschool and they don't know the letter names, that's not a measure of RAN, that's a measure of letter names then. But if they know their letter names, it's a better measure of RAN than anything else we can buy. So sit down with kids, even know their letter names. That's probably a better indicator of reading difficulty than almost anything else we can do.
Yeah, well said. And I do think with decoding dyslexia, I look at it from a sociological perspective as well. They were able to move the mark and get a lot of legislation in that helps us to meet the needs of any student. Again, it helps me really emphasize with my pre-service teachers the importance of knowing what goes into reading development, because if you can identify where that breakdown is and you know how to fill that gap, then all of our students are going to have a much better chance of being fluent readers and comprehending and doing all the great things that we can do once we can read fluently.
Well, I was about to say, the science, in my opinion, the science of reading movement was born out of decoding dyslexia. Yeah. It was that push from that group that finally got the country to sit up and say, wait, something's not working.
I actually teach at the beginning of my semesters the history of reading, and I include Emily Hanford's right in there because the way she brought the attention in concert with decoding dyslexia and groups like that. We owe a lot to them. And I think systemically, they're great entities and groups. Lindsay, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I agree with that. I'm so thankful for Emily and decoding dyslexia. It's great. I just had a question about RAN. So I have, I use Acadience, formerly known as DIBELS Next. So we have a letter naming fluency indicator. What's the difference between that and RAN?
If you were to untime it and show every kid the letter and they know all the names, so then it's simply a measure of how quickly they say it. That's a measure of RAN. If they don't know the letter names, then it's no longer a measure of RAN. That's why you have to use something like pictures or colors or something like that, where the kids know all the stimulus. They can tell you what it is. It's just simply a measure of how quickly they can see. Okay. If they know the letter names, it's a measure of RAN.
That's a great point, and something for all teachers to be aware of, especially if you're using a CBM like that has that measure in it. All right, now our time is coming to a close. Donnell, Lindsay, do you have any other questions for Matt?
No, I don't have any questions, but Matt, I have sure appreciated this conversation. It's been fantastic. And it should set an example for having good conversations. And you can talk about things that maybe you find challenging. Maybe you had your heart set on something, but there's still room and should always be room for a conversation about, well, maybe you haven't thought about this. Have you looked at that? I think this has been a great example of that. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. And I do wish we would have those conversations more. Practitioners through social media, interact with researchers now, but they have to remember researchers are usually some of the least socially skilled people you'll ever meet. Right. And so I'm used to saying to someone, a colleague next door saying, well, no, you're wrong. Johnson and Thompson in 2008 found this and you're wrong. And so we don't have a good skill set to have these conversations. So I really encourage you to engage, but recognize if they're blunt, it's just that's how we talk to each other. And we as researchers need to do a better job. And I've learned that through, Donna taught me that, and all the social media really taught me that you have to learn how to talk to a practitioner. And so I really think we should work with researchers to learn how to do that better as well.
Yeah, actually being a literacy coach taught me that, sometimes the hard way. So yeah, I think that's a very valid point. Lindsay and I joke about this all the time. Sometimes we get called candid. That's a word. But yeah, Lindsay, what were you going to say?
Oh, nothing. This was great. Thank you so much, Matt, for being on, and also for always answering my questions whenever I email you.
Well, thank you. I love the work you do.
Thank you so much for being our second guest and for all the conversation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and thank you for the things you've studied and your contributions. We wish you a lot of luck in Florida. I think that's exciting. And what a powerhouse. You and Holly Lane, all in the same department, right?
Yes, our offices will be next to each other. I can't wait.
Oh, wow.
It's going to be great.
That's going to be awesome. Well, we look forward to more contributions then from both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Matt, anything else you'd like to discuss or leave with us? Any wisdom or?
I love this podcast, and I am a subscriber and have listened before, obviously. And I really appreciate the translation of the work that you do and the research that goes on into a very consumable format. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for this episode of Literacy Talks, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for joining us today for Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. We hope you'll join the Science of Reading Collective, our free community, so you can stay current with the profession's newest thinking, free webinars, resources, and more. Visit Literacy Talks online for access to all episodes and more at readinghorizons.com/literacy talks. It's an exciting time to teach reading and help all students reach grade level proficiency this school year. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Join us next time.